The jungle had always been a mystery, an ancient, breathing entity that had swallowed countless explorers throughout history. For Mark and his team, this was supposed to be just another expedition. Document wildlife, capture footage, get in, get out. They had done it 100 times before. But this time was different. This time the jungle had other plans. The team of 5, Mark, a wildlife photographer, Jason, a biologist, Rebecca, a researcher, and 2 seasoned guides, Marco and Luis, set out before dawn. The mission was straightforward: track and film a rare jungle predator rumored to roam deep in the rainforest. Scientists had debated its existence for years. Was it an undiscovered species, a legend, or something far worse? For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. The jungle was dense, humid, alive with the sounds of birds and unseen creatures. The path was difficult, but Luis, the lead guide, had spent his entire life navigating these forests. His instincts were sharp. He knew every plant, every sound, every warning sign of a predator nearby. Then, the storm came. It started with a distant rumble. Within minutes, the sky turned black, and the rain fell in sheets, drenching everything in an instant. Thunder cracked like gunfire, shaking the very ground beneath them. The jungle transformed. What was once a clear path became a maze of twisted roots and rising water. "We need to turn back," Luis said, his voice strained. But it was too late. The storm had erased their trail. The GPS flickered, no signal. The satellite phone, dead. That's when the realization hit them. They weren't just deep in the jungle. They were lost. Mark's group wasn't new to survival situations, but the jungle they found themselves in felt wrong. Even after the storm passed, the air was heavy, stagnant. Normally, after a storm, the rainforest comes alive, birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves dripping with fresh rain. But here, silence. "This isn't right," Jason muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Why is everything so quiet?" Luis and Marco exchanged uneasy glances. They knew this silence wasn't natural. The jungle was never silent, not unless something had scared everything into hiding. Their first instinct was to get their bearings, but even that proved impossible. Rebecca pulled out a compass. The needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. "This has to be broken," she muttered, shaking it. But it wasn't. Luis checked his own. Same thing. A compass malfunction was unusual, but not unheard of. Magnetic interference, metal deposits. There were logical explanations. But what about 2 compasses? What about 3? Every single one of them was broken. With no GPS and no compass, they had only one choice: keep moving. For hours they trudged forward, hacking through vines and undergrowth, desperate to find a river, a clearing, any sign of direction. But the deeper they went, the stranger things became. Then they found the first tree. Jason was the first to notice it. A massive tree trunk, its bark stripped in long, deep gashes. At first they assumed it was an animal mark, maybe a jaguar sharpening its claws. But then Mark noticed something else. The markings weren't random. They were symbols, carved into the wood with precision. "It's a warning," Luis muttered, running his hand over the grooves. But a warning for what? Before anyone could answer, they heard it. A whisper. Faint. Distant. Words they couldn't understand. Rebecca turned sharply. "Who said that?" The others looked at her. No one had spoken. The jungle remained still. Then, from somewhere in the trees, the whisper came again. Mark and his team were used to the sounds of the wild, the distant calls of birds, the rustling of unseen creatures, the constant hum of life that filled the jungle like a never-ending song. But this jungle was different. After that whisper, that voice that no one could explain, the silence felt deafening. like the jungle itself was holding its breath. Luis, the guide, was the first to break the silence. He had spent most of his life in forests like this, but even he looked uneasy. "We need to move. Now." No one argued. By the time they found a clearing, the light had started to fade. The jungle canopy was so thick that even midday felt like dusk. They had no choice. They had to set up camp. Luis and Marco quickly cleared a space, setting up their tents. Mark gathered firewood. Jason tried the radio. Nothing. The only comfort they had was the small fire they built. The flickering light felt like the only thing keeping the growing darkness at bay. But then, at exactly 2:13 a.m., something moved. Mark was half asleep when he heard it. Footsteps, heavy, slow, circling the camp. At first, he thought it was Marco or Luis checking the perimeter. But then he noticed something. The steps weren't coming from the ground. They were above them, in the trees. Jason, sleeping in the tent next to him, stirred. "You hear that?" he whispered. Mark nodded. Slowly, he unzipped the tent flap. The fire had burned low, casting deep shadows. The jungle beyond the trees was pure blackness. But something was moving. Jason grabbed a flashlight and shined it toward the trees. The moment the light hit the branches, the footsteps stopped. Jason's breathing was ragged. What was that? Mark's throat was dry. He didn't have an answer. Luis and Marco emerged from their tents, both pale. Luis didn't look at them. He looked at the trees. Then he whispered, "We're not alone." Then the voice came again. Software distant, whispering. But this time, it was coming from inside the camp. Mark turned sharply, his flashlight swinging wildly. Nothing. Then Luis gasped. He pointed at the dirt around their campfire. There were footprints, but they weren't theirs. The footprints led in a perfect circle around their camp, and at the very center, drawn in the dirt, was a symbol, a spiral, carved into the ground with something sharp. Jason swallowed hard. What the hell does that mean? No one had an answer. But Luis looked terrified. "We need to leave," he whispered. But the jungle had other plans. Luis took one step toward his tent, and that's when the fire died. Not all at once, but like something had stepped in front of it, like something was blocking the flames. For the first time, Mark saw it. A shape, a figure, standing just beyond the tree line in the thickest part of the darkness. Watching, waiting. The moment Jason turned his flashlight toward it, it was gone. For the rest of the night, no one slept. No one spoke. But they all heard it. A whisper, circling their camp from every direction, repeating the same phrase over and over. "You're not supposed to be here." The jungle felt different in the daylight, but it didn't feel safer. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, swallowing the horizon. The air was thick, suffocating, and filled with the constant sound of life. Insects buzzed, birds shrieked. But underneath it all, there was something else. A presence. Mark and his team had no explanation for what they had heard the night before. The whispers, the footprints, the shadow standing just beyond the firelight. Luis, their guide, had said one thing before they broke camp. "We need to get out before nightfall." No one argued. But they didn't know yet. The jungle wasn't done with them. Jason pulled out their GPS unit. It had stopped working the night before, the screen flashing errors. They tried again. Still nothing. "The signal's dead. We have to rely on the map," Jason muttered, rubbing his temples. Luis shook his head. "No point. The storm wiped out the paths. We go in the wrong direction, and we'll just go deeper." That thought made Mark's stomach drop. The deeper they went, the harder it would be to leave. As they moved, Mark kept noticing something strange. The jungle had patterns. Every so often he would see something familiar, a twisted tree trunk, a broken branch, a strange symbol carved into the bark, like they were walking in circles. Then he felt it, that same feeling from the night before, the weight of unseen eyes. He stopped walking, heart pounding. His breath turned cold. Somewhere behind him, hidden in the trees, something shifted. After hours of hiking, they found a river. It was wide, too deep to cross easily. But the water was clear, and for the first time, they felt some relief. Then Luis froze. Jason followed his gaze, and his face drained of color. The footprints, not theirs. They were small, barefoot, like a child's, leading from the trees, straight into the river. But none came out. Luis was breathing hard. He turned back. "We need to leave. Now." But Jason wasn't listening. He was staring at something through the trees, a structure, a cabin. Mark's stomach twisted. That doesn't make sense. They were deep in the jungle, miles from any settlement. There shouldn't be anything out here. But there it was, an old wooden cabin, half covered in vines, sitting in the middle of nowhere. The door was slightly open. Inside, something was waiting. The air felt wrong as they stood in front of the cabin. The jungle was never silent. There was always a constant hum of life. Insects chirping, distant animal calls, the rustling of unseen creatures moving through the undergrowth. But now, nothing. It was as if the jungle itself had stopped breathing. Mark's skin prickled. Every instinct told him to leave. Jason, however, had already stepped forward. It could be a research station. Maybe someone's inside. Luis grabbed his arm. "Number, we should go." Jason shook him off. "We need shelter, food, a way out. If there's a radio, we can call for help." Luis didn't move. His face was pale. His hands trembled. "This place isn't for us." Jason pushed open the door. It creaked loudly, breaking the unnatural silence. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and something else, something rotting. The walls were covered in carvings. Symbols scratched deep into the wood, repeating over and over. Not in any language Mark had ever seen. A single wooden table sat in the center of the room. 3 chairs. One of them was pulled out, like someone had just been sitting there. And then, the bowl. Sitting on the table was a wooden bowl filled with raw meat. Fresh. The blood hadn't even dried. Jason turned pale. "Someone is here." Luis didn't step inside, but Mark did. His hands shook as he ran his fingers over the strange carvings on the walls. Jason was already searching through a wooden cabinet. Then he found it. An old leather-bound notebook. He flipped through the pages, his breathing quickening. "These are dates," he whispered. "Logs. Someone was tracking something out here." Then he stopped on the last entry. The handwriting was different, uneven, frantic. "It knows when you're alone. Don't look in the corners. Don't speak its name. If you hear it whisper, run." Jason's mouth opened to say something. But then they heard it. A sound from behind the cabin. A slow, rhythmic scraping, like something sharp dragging across the wooden wall. Luis backed away, whispering something in Spanish under his breath. Jason pointed toward the back of the cabin. There was a door, slightly ajar. The noise was coming from behind it. Mark forced himself to move forward. His breath felt tight, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He reached out, his fingers barely touching the wood. And the door slammed shut. From the other side, something moved. Not walking, not breathing. Something shifting, something waiting. Then, a whisper, right next to his ear. "You shouldn't be here." Jason ripped the door open. There was nothing, just a small, empty room, a bed, a dresser, a mirror. But the carvings were everywhere. "Do not speak to it. Do not stay after dark." It knows when you see it. Jason turned to Mark, his face pale. We have to go. Now. Luis was already out the door, but Mark's eyes drifted toward the mirror. For the briefest second, he swore he saw something. A shape, standing behind them, watching, smiling. Then the cabin door slammed shut behind them. The moment they stepped out of the cabin, everything changed. The jungle, once thick with the constant sounds of life, had gone completely silent. No insects, no birds, no distant rustling of unseen creatures moving through the leaves. Just silence. Jason grabbed Mark's arm, his voice barely above a whisper. We should never have come here. Luis was already moving ahead, glancing over his shoulder. We need to go. Now. They didn't stop to check their maps, didn't try to navigate their way back the way they came. They just ran. The further they moved from the cabin, the worse the feeling became. Every step felt like wading through something thick, something unnatural, as if the jungle itself was trying to slow them down. Mark tried to keep up with Luis, but something in his gut told him to look back. He turned, and there, standing just at the tree line where the cabin disappeared into the shadows, was the figure. Not moving, not chasing, just watching. The deeper they ran into the jungle, the more they heard it. A whisper, not from behind them, from all around them, like the trees themselves were speaking, like whatever had been in that cabin was everywhere now. You shouldn't have come. The whisper came from Mark's left, then his right, then from right behind his ear. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He turned, but there was nothing there. Just as panic threatened to take over, Jason suddenly stopped. Mark nearly crashed into him. What the hell are you doing? Jason pointed ahead. There, cutting through the jungle, was a trail, a narrow, beaten path leading deeper into the trees. Mark frowned. That wasn't there before. Luis shook his head. Number it wasn't. For a moment, none of them moved. The jungle was still silent, the air thick, suffocating. Jason's voice was tight. It wants us to go that way. Mark looked back the way they came, but there was nothing. No sign of the path they had just taken. No sign of any path at all. They had no choice. They followed the trail. After 30 minutes of walking, the jungle opened up into something unexpected. Ruins. Old, broken structures barely standing, covered in vines and moss. Jason exhaled sharply. What is this place? Luis shook his head, stepping carefully over the stones. People lived here once. Mark's stomach churned. Then why did they leave? Jason turned in a slow circle, studying the ruins. And that's when he saw it. The symbols, carved into the stones, the same ones from the cabin. And beneath them, more writing. Jason knelt down, brushing away the dirt. His voice barely rose above a whisper as he read. It follows. It waits. No one leaves. The moment Jason spoke the words, the air changed. A low hum filled the jungle, deep, resonant, vibrating through their bones. Then just ahead, past the ruins. Then just ahead, past the ruins. Something stepped into view, not running, not hiding, standing, waiting, watching. And for the first time, it moved. Mark doesn't remember running, doesn't remember how they got out of the jungle. All he remembers is the figure stepping toward them, and then nothing. When he opened his eyes, they were at the edge of the jungle, covered in scratches, exhausted, dehydrated. Luis was shaking, whispering a prayer under his breath. Jason sat beside him, staring at the camera in his hands. Mark swallowed. Do you remember what happened? Jason's fingers clenched around the camera. No. But when they checked the footage, their blood ran cold. The final picture on the camera? A blurry figure standing in the trees, watching, waiting,